Thus far, we've identified that solvency is important because it's a change in the nature of the contract between the firms. And we've identified that solvency is being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. We've also found that it can be unclear at the actual where the point of insolvency occurs when you're facing financial duress, and that's because of uncertainty around many of the decisions that we're dealing with. Because of this uncertainty, there's been a really quite recent change just last year in the defences to solvency. So for that reason, what I'm going to do now is go through the tests that are used, the traditional defences that we've had, but also this new defence, this safe harbour provision. At the moment, there's a reasonable amount of conjecture as to how it will operate, and until we get some cases on it, we've got a kind of best guess as to how things are going to be interpreted. What we do have up on the website, for those who are super interested, is the explanatory memorandum that went into Parliament. So this is what Parliament says it's trying to do by putting this provision in. Whether that comes to fruition, we'll have to wait and see in the courts. But so why don't we dive in as to how we decide whether a director has been fulfilling their duties around trading while insolvent. So the key provision is section 588G. Okay, so when have we got insolvent trading in breach of 588G? Well, a director and company is insolvent at the time of the debt or because of a debt. Okay, so we have to have the company becoming insolvent when they get the debt or because of the debt. So the debt that takes you into insolvency, yeah, then you've breached it. What am I trying to say? Well, imagine that everything's finally balanced, and if you paid your debts as and when they fell due, you would have 1 cent in your bank account, right? At that point, you're solvent. Then imagine you take on a debt for, it doesn't matter the amount, $1 million. At that point, if you can't pay the $1 million back when it's due, that's when you become insolvent, when you take on that debt, right? Because you can no longer afford to pay it when it's due. So it's taking on that debt that brings about the insolvency, not the inability to pay per se. Okay, second thing that we need, because it's an and, right? So the debt takes you into insolvency, that you can't pay it back. The second thing is you had reasonable grounds to suspect insolvency, and that you were aware of those grounds, or a like person in a like position would be aware. So why is this important? This means it's an objective test. It's both a subjective test, and because of that, and an objective test. So if you knew that you couldn't pay the debt back, you were aware of the grounds, you're in breach. Okay, let's just say you can't read financials. So you didn't know you couldn't pay it back, but a reasonable person who could read the financials would know that, right? That's the objective test, and that's a higher standard. So that would mean the combination of being subjective and objective makes this quite a high standard. If a reasonable person would have been aware that you can't pay the debt back, then you're in breach. And so you have to not be able to pay the debt back. There must be reasonable grounds for suspecting insolvency. Someone, and the objective person, would have been aware of those grounds, and if you fail to take action. So if you meet all 4 of those, you'll be in breach of section 588G. As we were saying, the issue about being aware is an objective test. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, whether you have reasonable grounds for suspecting insolvency is done from the position of an objective observer. And the question is, would an ordinary competent director be aware? Yes? And an ordinary competent director would be financially literate. Okay? So what they're saying is, if you had an ordinary director who can read and understand the financials and who is executing due care and diligence and paying attention, would they have been aware of insolvency? And most likely, the answer is going to be yes. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you knew or not. The test is whether someone in the position who was competent and paying attention would have known that the company was approaching insolvency. What we can see is that the business judgment rule doesn't apply, right? Because the business judgment rule applies only to due care and diligence. So what defences do you have? Well, we now have this safe harbour provision. The safe harbour provision is section 588GA. Okay. And what's it say? If you start to suspect the company may become or be insolvent, you can have a defence where you develop one or more courses of action reasonably likely to lead to a better outcome. Okay. So this is a major change because it says if you start making a plan of action to limit the damage from the insolvency, you can be protected against a breach of 588G. You couldn't do that before, so this has been a major change in what you're allowed to do around insolvency. The defence doesn't apply if you don't take a course of action, when you cease to take a course of action, or when you start to know that it's not going to lead to a better outcome. Okay, so this is when this safe harbour provision starts to drop out. So we're in the position, you see insolvency, you start developing an emergency plan. You'll be protected by 588G if that plan is reasonably likely to lead to a better outcome, up until you don't take action, you stop taking that action, or you become aware that the action isn't going to lead to a better outcome. So the keys to this defence are that it has to be reasonably likely that you'll get a better outcome. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty around what these things mean until we get some judgments. Some ideas from the Memorandum of Understanding are set out here. Hoping that you'll get a better outcome is not a defence. Right? You need to be informed and probably be getting advice, and that advice saying it will be a better outcome. Right? If you can do that, then it's reasonably likely you'll get a better outcome. Any evidence that your course of action is likely to lead to a better outcome. Notice this is about your action and the likelihood associated with your action at the time. You don't have to be successful to use the defence, but you have to have evidence that your action is reasonably likely to lead to that better outcome. So a director needs to properly inform themselves about it, take appropriate steps if there's any misconduct, because that won't exempt you, take appropriate steps to ensure that you're keeping financial records so you're able to maintain control over the finance, that you get proper advice around the action that you're taking, and that you're developing and or implementing some form of action to lead to an improvement in the financial position. They are the factors that a court's going to look at to understand whether or not you can use this safe harbour defence. Importantly, if you're going to use this defence, the burden is on you to show that evidence. Okay, so you have to be able to document that you had this reasonable likelihood of a better outcome. The second thing to understand is that it doesn't apply to employee entitlements or wages, doesn't apply to tax, right? So you're still going to be liable for those things if the plan doesn't work out. So there's some really important carve-outs there for the defence as well. Finally, Section 588, think it's GA, is not the only defence safe harbour. There's the traditional defences that have been available under Section 588H. The courts have shown that these defences are quite hard to actually make out, but let's look at them anyway. The first defence, you can say you haven't breached 588G if you as a director can show you had reasonable grounds to expect solvency. So when might that happen? Well, that might happen if there's fraud, right? And you're being given accounts that show you're solvent and then it turns out that they're untrue. Well, that's true, but the problem in most cases is that there are non-financial indicators that you have liquidity problems. Okay, so they could be suppliers are making you pay cash on delivery, checks are bouncing. There could be a whole series of non-financial measures. Now, an ordinary competent director will investigate those things. Okay, so because liquidity problems most often will also lead to operational problems, you can't just say, oh, I was given doctored accounts. Most times there will be other signals and you need to be alert for those. Okay, so the second one, relied on a subordinate who the director believed confident and reliable. Okay, so you can rely on a subordinate, but remember from delegations in Module 2, we dealt with when can you rely on a delegate. You can rely on a delegate if and only if you've done competent HR reference checks that they're competent, and 2, there's no red flags. The problem for most directors trying to use this defence is that either they had an incompetent person and they didn't do their HR properly, or there were huge red flags leading up to the insolvency. Right? The accounts weren't being produced, or they were inaccurate, or there were problems with them. If you have that, an ordinary competent director is going to investigate them. And if you investigate those problems, right, then you wouldn't have a reasonable expectation of solvency. So that becomes a defence that's hard to make out. You can get a leave of absence. So if you're ill or you have another good reason and you're not actually involved, again, that's a question of fact, and you'd have to be pretty clearly ill for a reasonable period of time or have a leave of absence for a reasonable period of time. The final defence is that you took all reasonable steps to stop the debt that takes you into insolvency. Again, I think that recognises that the board as a group makes decisions. You as an individual can only do your best. And if you've done all that you could reasonably do, you won't be held accountable if the group makes a different decision. Again, they're the traditional defences, quite hard to make out in reality, because an ordinary competent director will actually follow through on signals of problems that they see when they're governing the company. And we have another short video that goes through how to maybe analyse the financials. These next 2 slides set out some of the things you might want to look at to determine whether a company's solvent. They include financial measures, particularly liquidity ratios. The quick ratio and the current ratio are important. Particularly important are cash flows, because it is basically a cash flow test. Often, your operating cash flow gives you a very good first indication about solvency problems, and the other video will go through that in more detail. It's also critical to remember that there are many other non-financial indicators of a solvency problem. These are the kinds of things that an ordinary competent director would want to investigate further if they were happening, because they're often a signal that you have a solvency problem. Again, this list comes from various case law. I think the water wheel case involving John Elliott was one of the particular cases that it comes from. So you can see, are directors resigning and you don't know why? Are the banks pulling their loans? Can you get other capital or finance, or are you stuck? You can't get further equity. The payment terms are lengthening. in your accounts, or people are trying to take legal steps to recover the debt. You've got trading losses, post-dated or dishonoured checks, cash on delivery from suppliers, an inability to actually see the financial figures, right, is an indicator that things aren't good in terms of financials. Overdue payments, particularly payroll tax, group tax and statutory liabilities. All of those might not show up on your financial accounts, but they are all important indicators that you may have a problem with solvency. Finally, the law is very clear that just because you didn't understand finances won't absolve you of liability here. I won't bother going into why that's the case. It's a matter of policy. It opens up companies to be governed and owned and directed by a broad range of people. If we started, for instance, allowing people to get out of their accountability for insolvency due to a lack of knowledge, what you would find is things like banks wouldn't lend to uneducated people. And that's not an outcome that we want in society. We want people to have open access to debt and the markets to go forth with free enterprise. So for a matter of policy, ignorance is no excuse, right? It's assumed you can read the financials and can recognise it. That's what an ordinary competent director can do. The final little section we're going to deal with is external audit, and we'll do that next.